Good evening, and welcome to ASIS Student Chapter's Faculty Primetime Program. My name is Sarah Emerson, and I'm the chair of the SJSU ASIS Student Chapter. Our program tonight is a Faculty Primetime event, the second in our series, which features SJSU SLIS faculty guest speakers presenting on topics relating to their professional interests and experiences. Tonight's presentation will last approximately 1 hour, including time provided for a Q&A session after the presentation. At this time, I will now turn the mic over to Frank Florian, the ASIS Student Chapter Program Director, who has the distinct honor of introducing tonight's guest speaker.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Just to get a smiley face, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So, hi everyone, and as Sarah said, welcome to our chapter's second professional speaker event. This evening we are pleased to welcome Dr. Judy Weedman, who many of you might be familiar with through having taken a class with her, such as 202 Information Retrieval, 244 Online Searching, 247 Vocabulary Design, or one of the 287 seminars in information science. Dr. Weedman received a BA in philosophy from the University of Colorado, an MLS from the University of Oregon, and a Ph.D. in information and library science from the University of Michigan. Within the field of information science, her area of specialization is knowledge production. She has studied communication patterns of scholars, use of electronic media for professional socialization, interdisciplinary collaboration and large-scale research projects, and the design of vocabularies for information retrieval. Dr. Weedman's work has been published in journals of several disciplines, including information science, communication, and computer science. She regularly presents at conferences such as those of the American Society for Information Science and Technology, which is coming up soon, and the Joint Conference of Digital Libraries. Dr. Weedman's talk this evening will cover the various information environments in which she has worked over the course of her career, starting with her work in a public library before library school, and including a school library, various special libraries, the information industry, and then eventually moving into her Ph.D. work and experience as a faculty member. Intermixed with these will be her insights and perspectives on thesaurus design, journal indexing, and vocabulary design. I just realized I never showed you guys, never forwarded the slide. So there's a slide introducing Dr. Weedman, and here's a slide introducing her talk. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome and a virtual round of applause to Dr. Judy Weedman.
Thank you very much. You're all hearing me okay? Okay, good. I decided that since Frank said in his posting to the various listservs that I was going to give insights into vocabulary design, it might be a really good idea for me to start by explaining what is vocabulary design for those of you who haven't taken the class and might be unsure. Basically, it's the design of various ways of organizing information. It can be things like subject headings and descriptors, or it can be classification systems and taxonomies. Tagging is really interesting because by nature, it's group design. It's not a vocabulary that's controlled by any specific individual, and yet there is a lot of peer pressure, in a sense, through tag clouds to make the vocabulary more and more uniform over time. So that's just a little explanation at the beginning to make sure that you know what I'm talking about as we go through this. I'd like to say hi to the people whose names are very familiar to me on the list of participants. It's good to see names of people I know, and it's good to have a chance to meet those of you whom I haven't had in class and whom I don't know. Okay, so this is starting on a somewhat personal note. Frank mentioned that I started my career in a public library. I was in high school at the time, and I probably should explain why it even occurred to me to look for a job in a public library. And it goes back to the school library that I worked in when I was in junior high. In junior high, ninth graders could work as aides in the library during their study halls. And the year that I was in 8th grade, there was the most beautiful girl who was working as the student during the period that I happened to have study hall too. And she sat behind the circulation desk, and this is back in the days of stamped cards, and so she had her little stamp in one hand and she was flipping over cards, date due cards, with the other hand. And she looked so beautiful sitting there. She had long dark hair, she had a lovely figure, she had a pretty face, and she looked so beautiful sitting there stamping the date due cards that I thought, I want to look like that. And so I decided I had to be an assistant in the library during my study hall the next year when I was a 9th grader. So that's the crass beginning of what became a long career. In 9th grade, we had to write an essay about what we wanted to do when we grew up. And the only job I could think of was librarian, and I had no idea at that point if I wanted to be a librarian or not, but this was 9th grade and I was working in the library during my study hall, and I was having a lot of fun. So I just picked that sort of, for lack of any better idea, to write my my essay on. And somehow in the process of reading about librarians and libraries and writing the essay, I didn't ever really decide that I was going to be a librarian, but somehow that it just became settled that that was what I was going to do. And I started harassing the public library to give me a job. Well, when I was 14, they wouldn't, but I kept harassing them, and I had interviewed the public librarian, the director of the library, for the assignment that I did in the 9th grade. So that gave me a perfect excuse to get to know her and ask about jobs at the library, and I just kept calling her back at intervals. And eventually she told me that somebody had just quit because she cheated on her time cards, and so she actually had an opening and would I like to apply. So I did. So I got my first library job because somebody was cheating, turning in her timesheet, and there I was. And I was a shelver in the children's room, which gave me access to the whole collection. You learn the collection better as a shelver than you do in probably any other aspect of librarianship, because you physically touch those books. Even the ones that don't circulate you touch, because you have to move them aside to put the books that did circulate back in their proper spots. So that's sort of how I got to the beginning of being interested in libraries. I decided I wanted to be a school librarian, despite the fact that I was working in a public library then. And I honestly don't remember anymore why. I thought it sounded like more fun, but I don't remember why I thought it sounded like more fun, because I was having a lot of fun at the public library. So I decided I would be a school librarian, and when I went to college I majored in education and elementary education, and I was so bored I thought I was going to die. It was awful. Ed school doesn't have to be a bad experience. At my university, for me, at that time, it was a terrible experience. I had a friend who was taking a class in printing, not fine book printing, but how to print so you could teach students how to print. And that was just not what I wanted to learn how to do in college. That was not why I went to the university. So in a class that I was close to failing, I had several conversations with the instructor because I couldn't understand anything she said, and unfortunately she had written the textbook as well, so the textbook didn't help me understand the instructor any better. And at one point, in sheer frustration on both our sides, she was trying so hard to help me and I was trying so hard to figure it out, and it just wasn't working. She finally looked at me and she said, "You sound like a philosophy major." And she said it in sort of a pejorative way. And I thought, you know, that might be better than elementary education. And I switched my major to philosophy. I did take one class first to make sure that this was a reasonable sort of thing to do. You know, if she'd said, "You sound like a physics major," I would not have made that change. But philosophy sounded okay. So I thought, okay, I'll just be some other kind of librarian. You know, I knew enough about library programs that I knew if I didn't go into school libraries, it really didn't matter that much what my undergraduate degree was. So I was free to major in anything I wanted to. And philosophy turned out to be the most interesting thing of all the classes I took in literature and sciences and psychology and sociology. Philosophy was for sure the one that grabbed me and got my interest. And so I graduated. When my husband and I had both graduated, we moved to Oregon, and as Frank said, I went to library school there. The catch was we moved in April, and I couldn't start school in the summer because they were already full for summer or something. But I figured out I'm not a very good person about rules. I realized what I could do, and nobody told me this. I just realized that the ed school had room, so I could enroll as a student in the ed school for the summer and then just change my major in the fall. So I did that. Didn't explain to the ed school what my intentions were. I just did it. And as long as I was there in an ed school again, I thought, well, I should check and see what it would actually take here in Oregon to be a school librarian. And it turned out with the credits that I had already completed in Colorado, I only had to take 2 classes and do student teaching. And the 2 classes I had to take were developmental psychology classes. So that actually sounded pretty doable. So I decided I would be a school librarian after all. And did the student teaching, took the 2 developmental psych classes, and wound up being a school librarian for 7 years. And I loved it. School librarians had the same issues then that they have now about names and titles. My official title when I left there was School Library Media Specialist. Or maybe it was School Library Media Teacher, because what was happening was with budget crunches, specialists were getting let go by the school district. So I think we actually wound up with School Library Media Teacher as our title, so that we would sound just as important as the real teachers. And of course we all had to have teaching credentials anyway. But there's always this sort of juggling act of who you are. One of the things I found to be true in public schools is, unless it's a big school with several librarians, you're the only one. Your principal doesn't know anything, usually, about your field of expertise, may not think it's important, may think it's important but not know why, might not have any idea what you really should be doing. Well, that's very liberating in some ways. If they don't know what you should be doing, you can kind of do whatever you want to. And as you might have guessed by now, that's sort of appealing to me. The problem with it is they have no real way to evaluate you or to recognize what you're doing. So you have this real issue of educating your manager so that he or she understands what you're doing and why it matters. You have exactly the same problem with your colleagues. A lot of the teachers I worked with didn't even realize I had to have a teaching certificate and were surprised and impressed when they found out that I did. Again, they had no idea of what a librarian could contribute to education. No idea of how I could help them, and no idea of what I could do on my own. So there was this constant issue, and not a bad issue because I was in a school with really great people, but there was this constant need to keep them informed about what I could do, what I might do, what I'd be willing to do if they wanted me to, and so on. One of the things that appealed to me a lot about being a school librarian was that I got to do everything. I did collection development, I did reader's advisory service, I did reference, I did the budget, I hired staff. If it was going to get done, it was my job to get it done. And I really liked the breadth that gave me. I've never wanted to be slotted into being just a serials librarian or a humanities librarian. I liked the fact that I could do everything. And I liked the fact that my job spanned the entire curriculum and all the grade levels because, again, it was just so much variety. And it was so interesting to me just to deal with all those subjects and also to work with all the students. Organizational culture is important if you're one of a kind. It's always an important thing to think about when you're on the job. But if you're the only one of your kind on that job, then the culture becomes very important. And it's useful if you can, to some extent, take on a little bit of camouflage so that you look like everybody else or sound like everybody else. And I'm not at all advocating not being yourself, but certain things that you can do without compromising yourself just make you fit in better. For instance, when I first started as a school librarian, my official day was up at 4. I used to leave at 4. And one day a teacher said to me, "Yeah, you don't have any papers to grade, you can leave at 4. And I thought, oh, that makes me look really bad to take off as soon as I can. So I learned to, rather than coming an hour early in the morning to get work done when there weren't people using the library, I'd stay after, and that way people knew I was still there working, because it was a small parking lot. We always knew who was there and who wasn't there. And it happened to be a teacher whose window opened right onto the parking lot who made that comment. So those were just some aspects of working in a school library that I thought I would mention. I had figured I'd have about a 7-year lifespan in the public schools. I wasn't really sure that that was the right environment for me forever. So by about the 5th year, I started thinking, not in a very serious way, about what to do next. And as I saw it, I had 3 options. I could go up into district level administration. At that time, we had a very active library media coordinator, and she did have a really neat job, working on curriculum mostly for the library. Another way that I could make a change would be to go into some other kind of library. And I'd sort of looked at academic libraries and decided that wasn't the right place for me, mostly because they were so big, and I was beginning to realize that I liked being the whole show, and a special library might be more appealing in that way. And then, of course, the third option was to get a Ph.D., which didn't occur to me for years. But one of the instructors that I had as a student invited me back to speak to her class. And when she took me out to lunch to thank me afterwards, she said, "So when are you getting your Ph.D.?" And I thought, oh. And I thought, well, I don't know when, but I think I am someday. And so, when things got to a point in my life where I could do that, that's what I decided to do. I also had to have a job. I was not in the kind of situation where anybody was putting me through school. My parents probably would have, but there was no way I was going to let them. So I noticed that there was a company called University Microfilms International that was hiring a lot of Ph.D. students. They're part of ProQuest now. I'm not sure if they still have any identity on their own or not, but they are part of ProQuest. And so I thought, well, that sounds like fun. Now, did I know anything about indexing? No. But I thought that something about it just appealed to me. So I went and applied for a job, and they hired me. Well, as you can tell from what I've said up to this point, I had no training. I had absolutely no training on how to index. And the company didn't give me any training. They just handed me the thesaurus and a stack of journals and said, "Come back when you're done." So it was pretty scary. In some ways, it seemed like it shouldn't be that hard to find terms in a thesaurus and assign them to journal articles. And in other ways, I was aware I had no idea what I was doing. So I scrambled. The library school in Ann Arbor had a class on indexing, and I sat in on that. I read books about indexing. I tried to figure out why I was doing what I was doing. The editor I worked for never gave me any feedback, never gave me any evaluation, but he kept handing me stacks of journals to index, so I figured I was doing okay. But I still didn't really know what I was doing or why I was doing it. So I was doing all this self-education behind the scenes. And apparently it worked, because I've been involved with vocabularies and indexing in one way or another ever since. There were some things that I learned. One was that you really can index in almost any subject area, unless it's something with a vocabulary that is so specialized you just can't speak it. You know, I couldn't index specialized chemistry articles. There's no way. But just by reading articles in a particular subject domain, you begin to absorb the language. And pretty soon you understand what they're talking about, at least in a general way. And you understand it well enough that you can match concepts and particular terms in the thesaurus. So that was really interesting to me, to see that I could index in areas that I knew nothing about. One was life insurance, one was property and liability insurance, and one was criminal justice, which I knew a little bit about just from, you know, watching TV and reading the newspaper. And but I certainly didn't know anything very specialized or detailed about criminal justice. I just had these sort of vague notions, and I'd heard some of the words before. So that was one of the things that I learned that was really interesting, is that you really don't have to be a subject specialist. And the kind of specialist you become is a very weird sort of specialist. As far as I know, I was a good indexer in life insurance. But could I have told anybody what kind of life insurance they could buy or explained how it worked to them? No, not really. It was not a superficial knowledge, but it was a different kind of knowledge than I would have if somebody had taught me how to sell life insurance or something, or than I would have acquired in a business course on insurance. Another thing that emerged for me, and this all took place over a long period of time, was a notion of structure in controlled vocabularies. The particular thesaurus I was working with didn't have a really good, in fact, it didn't have any BT-NT relationships shown. It had terms that were broader than others and terms that were narrower than others, but it didn't show those in the thesaurus. It didn't show that one was broader or narrower than the other. And after I'd indexed for a year or so, I began to realize that if an article was about a term that was fairly narrow, it was also about the subject that was broader than that. So for instance, if an article was about stocks and bonds, it was also about investments. Or if an article was about defined benefit plans, it was also about retirement plans. And if it was about retirement plans, it was also about employee benefits. And I had this epiphany that I should assign all of those terms at each level of generality to an article. And I did that for a while. And my editor never told me I shouldn't. But one day I thought, wait a minute, how far do you go? You know, to take an animal example, you know, if it's a shrew, do I also assign mammal? And do I also assign vertebrate? And do I also assign the word animal? And do I also assign the term, you know, living kingdom or something? And I realized that this epiphany I'd had, this great experience of suddenly understanding broader and narrower term relationships, was completely wrong. They were broader and narrower term relationships, but it didn't make any sense to assign all of them. It only made sense to assign the one that actually fit that article, the one that was the most specific to that article. So I went along merely indexing badly for a while, and nobody straightened me out, but eventually I got over my epiphany and I straightened out and I started indexing correctly again. So that was another insight I had, was the importance of structure when you're working with vocabularies. The other thing that I learned, I still find interesting and hard to believe, but it's true. I worked for this index called Life Insurance Index. I mean, does that sound like the most boring thing in the world? It did to me. The Criminal Justice Index sounded a lot more interesting because I got to think about murders and kidnaps and robberies and, you know, stuff like that. What I discovered was I didn't get bored doing indexing for Life Insurance Index at all. And I couldn't figure out why not. But eventually I realized that what was really interesting to me was fitting the words, the descriptors, the subject headings, and the thesaurus was finding a way to explain this long article in terms of maybe half a dozen terms from the thesaurus. In fact, now that I think about it, we had a limit of 5. We could go over that in an emergency, but we were supposed to stick to 5. And that was what was really interesting to me, was the relationship between the words and the total meaning of the article. And what I began to realize was that I thought of it for a while as like writing haiku, where I had maybe 17 syllables, to express some vast idea. I had 6 terms to express something that took the author maybe 6 pages or 12 pages to write. And that whole process just fascinated me, of how you could boil something down into something so much smaller and convey what it was about. And that kept life insurance from being boring, because it was that relationship. It was the structure of the thesaurus and the relationship between the limitations in the thesaurus and the breadth of the articles that for me was a source of just fascination. And I'm sure that makes me weird, but it was good because I also earned an income that way. So I was thinking, when Frank asked me to do this, sort of why I gravitated to vocabulary design and to indexing. And I realized that I thought back, and I could remember being in grade school and standing at the teacher's desk waiting to ask her some question while the person in front of me in line was asking her a question, and thinking, I don't really want to be a teacher. At that point in time, it was one of the obvious things that if you were a woman, you considered. And my grandmother had been a teacher in a one-room school, and she was retired at that point, but she had all these cool things that she had kept from her job as a teacher. She had pictures she'd torn out of magazines to put on the bulletin board. She had worksheets for all the different subjects that she'd taught. And since it was a one-room school, she taught all the subjects and all the grades. She had little pamphlets that were informative about this or that. And I remember standing there by my teacher's desk and thinking, no, I don't really want to be a teacher, but it would be really fun to organize all the stuff they have. It never occurred to me that was being a librarian. I mean, it just didn't even cross my mind. This was grade school. I hadn't seen Diane Sano being beautiful behind the checkout counter yet. And I can remember even thinking, could I stand having to teach all day just for the fun of organizing stuff? And I decided no, I really couldn't. Well, another sign of the fact that this probably was my true calling in life was I had a little camera, and my folks gave it to me sometime when I was in an elementary school. But I didn't make an album of my photographs. What this child did with her photographs was she filed them. I had a little index card, those metal cans, that you file index cards in, and they come with the dividers. And I made dividers and filed my photographs. And this was back when you could cut negatives up. So I cut up the negatives and filed them with the appropriate picture. And I went back and I looked when I started teaching indexing. I went back and I looked at that because I could remember doing it, but not what it said. And this was basically my classification system. Yeah, I think I was a natural, Frank. I just didn't know it for a long, long time. And if you look at this, it's really interesting how I did it. And I can say this because, I was like 10 years old then, so I don't feel like I'm being boastful if I say, look at this. Birthday, I put in parentheses 1958. Obviously, those are pictures from my birthday that year. And some years, I didn't put the date in parentheses. I did for Christmas. I did for Easter. I did for home. I did for camp. But then for some of them, I didn't put the years in parentheses. And that's because, for me, in my own mind, the trips to Guatemala, San Salvador, and Mexico were one-off events. It was something that was going to happen only once. It wasn't going to recur and happen again. So essentially, the Guatemala 1960 subject heading or class heading meant my trip to Guatemala in 1960. whereas birthday could be subdivided into my birthday in 1958 and 1959 and 2011, which I couldn't even conceive of at that point. Christmas I had, 2 different years. Vacation, I got really fancy there. This was essentially, this very last part of it was a golly, we've just been talking about that in my 202 class. You know what I'm going to say, pre-coordinate term, vacation, camp. And conceivably, you can see just from the structure, I could also have had vacation swimming or vacation boating or vacation Wyoming or something. So I foresaw vacation as something that would acquire other subdivisions, and what essentially was yet another subdivision, which was the year. What's most interesting to me about this structure is the only thing on there that isn't really a class of things is Lassie. I had gotten a dog when I was 5 or 6, and I'd named her Lassie because, of course, I'd been watching TV and watching Lassie on TV, and it just seemed like the perfect name for the perfect dog. So my friend Sandra, with whom I spent countless hours every day, her house was right behind me, and our fathers had built a gate so we could run back and forth between each other's houses. Sandra just got filed under friends, and so did Susan. They didn't get classifications of their own. But my dog got her own classification. And towards the end of this time, I'm going to talk a little bit about, the understandings that are embedded in controlled vocabularies and classification systems. And it's very clear what was important in my life. You can see that looking at this. The one thing that stood on its own and was not subsumed in any other category was my dog, whom my parents gave away shortly after that, but I won't tell you that story. I'll just tell you it broke my heart. So when I decided to get a Ph.D. and had to support myself, one of the things I did was indexing. I also spent time in special libraries. And I worked for a unit for laboratory animal medicine. That was on campus. It was the veterinarians who actually took care of animals that were used in various kinds of experiments and made sure that they were healthy, at least except for whatever it was the experimenter was doing to them. And experimentation with animals isn't always nefarious. Some of it is quite benign. Some of it's not, of course. My one big break was when the Institute for Technology Information had an opening for a special librarian. On my resume, I didn't look like a special librarian. I looked like a school librarian. But I applied for the job anyway because it sounded really interesting. The Institute for Technology Information was based in Ann Arbor, which was near Detroit, and they worked with the automotive industry. What they did was they did consulting. The whole firm, with however many people it had, probably close to 100, served as consultants to the automotive industry in 2 ways. One was consulting on the new technologies that were being implemented in manufacturing at that time, CAD and CAM and some other technologies. Then they had this whole social science wing that had social scientists in it who studied and did consulting on the effects on jobs, basically, of higher automation. So they were studying, de-skilling effects and how you could compensate for that, and how to keep it a good work environment even with more things being taken over by technology. And it just sounded so interesting, and I really wanted the job. Figured I didn't have a chance in the world of getting it, but I applied for it. And it turned out nobody else applied. So they either had to not hire anybody or hire me, and apparently I looked better than nobody. So they hired me. And I learned a lot working there, more than I'd actually learned at UM. I learned a lot about special libraries. I learned a lot about engineering. I learned a lot about the automotive industry. I don't remember any of it anymore, but at the time I knew a lot. And they also gave me my first chance to design a thesaurus a while later. I quit working, it was a couple of years later, I quit working for them as a regular employee and was hired as a consultant, and I designed a thesaurus for one of the collections they had. And I could make a decent case for the fact that I understood vocabularies because of my work as an indexer. And something I didn't mention when I was talking about indexing was eventually I was sort of semi-promoted to work as an editor for other indexers. I didn't do it all the time, but I filled in for people who were on sick leave or whatever. So that was my first chance to actually do vocabulary design, and that was really fun and really interesting. At the same time, I was working off and on for a firm of management consultants in human resources. And they didn't really have a library per se, but they had all of their materials that they used in consulting, and they also did training programs. And what I really was for them was more of an information analyst. I would not just find things they needed, but turn it into a form in which they could use it. So I didn't just give them, you know, a list of articles, and I didn't even just go retrieve the articles and give them copies of them. I worked it up into something that would be useful for them. As with school libraries, there are large special libraries too that employ 20 people or 5 people or whatever, but I, as always, tended to gravitate towards the areas where I was the only librarian. And I found out that special libraries have a whole lot in common with school libraries, which I never would have guessed and never would have expected. But you're in the same kind of situation. You're probably the only one of your kind in the entire organization, unless it's a large library. People don't know what you're supposed to be doing. They're not sure that you're doing anything valuable. And it's up to you to keep them well informed about what your potential is by offering them services and programs and materials, by talking to them about what they need and doing, you know, informal needs assessments or formal needs assessments. And I did that in school libraries too. I did actually a fairly formal needs assessment at one point with a questionnaire that people figured out. So it was very much like being in a school library. And Lauren, you're asking me what kinds of tools did I use to make the research useful? That's a good question. I guess it had to be a really in-depth understanding of that organization and what they needed. You know, I went to some of their training programs. I also, you know, I did everything for that management consulting firm, including, as they say, emptying the waste baskets. I even did bookkeeping, which I didn't do for long for reasons that you can imagine. I wasn't good at it. So it had to do with understanding really thoroughly what they were doing and understanding it so thoroughly that I could tell what was going to be important to them, and understanding how they were going to use it so that I could put it in that kind of form. I really didn't use tools. I mean, this was before, it was just with the advent of online searching and the advent of word processing, so there really weren't, you know, technological tools. It was mostly just figuring it out, as I say, on the basis of a really deep knowledge of the organization and a lot of questions. You know, I've never been embarrassed to ask questions and say, is this what you want, or is that what you want? How can I make this better? So I don't have, you know, any really good answer for you except that. And same point as school libraries, I actually got a very strong compliment when I wore a suit to work at ITI. I had been dressed like a faculty member, and that when I wore a suit and carried a briefcase, Janet made a point to say, "You look really good today, Judy," and I took the hint. I did just a little bit of consulting and information brokering. I never tried to support myself at it. If you're going to run a small business, you have to be willing to spend as much time marketing as you do in whatever the business is, and I wasn't that interested. But just because of what I knew, jobs would come to me once in a while, and that was always fun because it broadened my horizons and brought me into a different subject domain that I didn't know anything about before. So the Ph.D. at this point, the main reason that I decided to do a Ph.D. was because I wanted to teach people who would be school librarians. It seemed like a way to stay close to something that I had loved but didn't actually want to do anymore. The other thing that appealed to me was, I was a philosophy major. Of course I was going to like the idea of theory, right? I discovered that research was creative, which I didn't know before, and it was a creativity that I apparently had. And the idea of, every research project I would take on would be something new to learn was probably the clincher. The idea that I could just keep learning new things for the whole rest of my work life seemed too good to be true. So I started out wanting to be a faculty member who would teach school librarians, and I got totally seduced by information science. I fell in love with indexing and the whole idea of vocabulary design. I was by that time teaching online searching for the university, and that was fascinating because in one part of my job I was doing the indexing that put the information into the system, and then in my teaching I was teaching people how to understand that structure so they could get information out of the system. I got interested in scholarly communication because one of my friends failed one of her preliminary exam questions, which was on scholarly communication, and as she muttered about it and cursed the people who read her exam for failing her, I got really interested in her topic. And I'm almost out of time here because I do want to leave time for questions. But basically I was looking at scholarly communication looks at the way ideas move through a group of scientists or scholars in some area before they're ever published. So they look at what used to be called invisible colleges of people who are connected densely to one another and connected more loosely to everybody else in the field. Social network analysis doesn't have anything to do with social media, but it's looking at those kinds of connections where you can actually draw lines between this person and that person if they know each other. Bibliometrics, studying who cites whom, was another way of looking at connections and how ideas moved between people. I was talking in an airport one day to a woman who taught children's lit. I was on my way to, I don't remember what conference, but she was on her way to the same one. And she recommended a book to me that I read that completely changed my approach to everything I was doing. And actually that was what got me into the idea of social networks and the idea that things aren't just given, things are constructed. And I'm not going to talk about constructivism tonight. Some of you know about it from other classes and other sources. But the basic idea in socio-technical studies was that each shapes the other. People shape technology, technology shape people, but it doesn't end then. People don't always use technologies in the ways they were intended to be used. They then reshape the technology to be what they need it to be. So I was looking at movements of ideas through people, through groups of people. I was looking at movements of ideas across professional boundaries. Another research project I did, I actually started it before I'd finished my dissertation, was looking at a computer-mediated conference, which was just a very deluxe version of conference threads, and how it worked in professional socialization, how students used it to socialize themselves. I did a study of computer scientists and earth scientists who were collaborating. And again, I was looking at how they learned about each other as they tried to communicate across those disciplinary boundaries, and how that resulted and sometimes didn't result in the growth of knowledge. And then I was looking at digitization projects, and this was a few years ago when that was still pretty new and libraries were just beginning to digitize parts of their collection. And I was looking at how people made the decision to do a digitization project, how they learned how to do it once they decided, because most people were, this was new at the time. And again, looking at the way that, in this case, professional knowledge was growing. Somehow all of that got me into thinking about design, partly because I was teaching vocabulary design by that time, partly because that project with the computer scientists and earth scientists was a design project. They were designing computer technologies. And I started reading about design and started to wonder if vocabulary design was like other kinds of design. Or did all the stuff that had been written in architecture and software design and various other design fields, was it all irrelevant to vocabulary design, or was it relevant? And I'm going to skip over this slide, the bottom part of the slide, except to say that uncertainty was one of several things that turned out to be a constant across all design projects. You're making something that never existed before, and there's always uncertainty involved in that. So why I find vocabulary design interesting? It's creative. It doesn't seem like a list of words is all that creative, but it is in the creation of the structure more than the actual terms. I like the ontological issues that vocabulary design raises. If you don't have a word for it in your controlled vocabulary, it doesn't exist. And that's fascinating to me, because you often have to index articles for which you don't have a term in your vocabulary. And that's like saying it just simply doesn't exist for anybody who would use that index to look up articles. When do you add a term that's missing, and when do you not? And that's a whole long discussion itself. Bowker and Starr wrote a wonderful book called Classification and Its Consequences. And one of the points that they make is that when you create a world by creating a classification system or creating a vocabulary, you're embedding, without realizing it, values, worldviews, limits of knowledge that are not just your own personal ones, but those of the culture. And if you're interested, it's a terrific book to read. And it's the only one I think that they've co-authored, so it would be easy to find. There are linguistic issues involved. Those of you who have taken 247 have probably heard me talk about a group in my class one year that got totally wrapped around the difference, got their minds wrapped around the difference between a stable and a barn, and spent ages figuring out how you define them so that they mean two different things, or do they really mean two different things? The nuances and connotations of words, the structures that you build with them, all of that are linguistic questions. And then you get into historical, sociological, political issues as you watch how vocabularies change over time. And you've probably all seen examples from LC subject headings and various other places of subject headings that become inappropriate as our understanding of the world and the way we talk about the world changes. There are cultural issues embedded in vocabularies, and for some people there's a true beauty in the structures of a vocabulary. Sometimes when I read a back of the book index, it just feels so good, and I can't always articulate why. In fact, usually I can't. But there is a real beauty to structure. Some of you may be familiar with Oliver Sacks, who wrote books like The Woman Who Thought She Was a Hat, and he wrote the book Awakenings. I think there was a movie made on Awakenings. He's recently written a book called Musicophilia that he's a neurologist, and so he looks at various things about the brain. He was a really unhappy child. I won't go into the details, but his brother was mentally ill. It was during World War II, and he was sent away from his parents to live in the countryside in a really undesirable situation. And he talks about the first time he discovered the table of the elements, so when you walk into an old-fashioned chemistry classroom. And he talked about how wonderful it was. It was, for him, like a key to the universe. He said it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, and he loved the way the pieces linked, and this particular quote doesn't quite give a sense of that. But he goes on about the relationship shown in this table of the elements and the coherence that it gave to the world. And I know this is really weird, but I remember feeling that same kind of thing on a much lower emotional level when I first learned about the Dewey Decimal System. It just completely blew my mind when I learned in elementary school that you could organize every single thing into 10 categories and break it down. It was like, wow, the world makes sense in a way that I had never anticipated. I like this quote from Srinivasa Srinivasan, who used to be the editor-in-chief at Yahoo. What you're doing as you create a classification system, and that's what she's talking about in this case, is carving out differences and deciding which similarities are meaningful. Another quote that I really like is one in a book in engineering design, where he says in any classification scheme you're choosing the criteria by which you dismember a particular domain. I just somehow love that image of what I'm doing if I'm creating a classification system or a controlled vocabulary as dismembering a subject domain and pointing to the pieces with carefully selected words. This slide just shows the knowledge organization track, the topics that will come up during the ASIS&T annual meeting next week already. I don't have much to say about it, except that it indicates some of the areas where vocabularies are important. And then come back to this, and anybody who's taken 202 from me has seen this particular graphic, because I always want to explain what 202 has to do with anything else. 202 has the concepts in it that underlie vocabulary design, that underlie web design. It deals with organization like you do in cataloging and advanced cataloging. Differences in cataloging and in indexing, you're using a system someone else designed and applying it, whereas in vocabulary design, you're designing the system in the first place. And it has, as I've said, obvious relevance to information retrieval in various ways, retrieving information as part of reference services, online searching, and other classes that are similar to that. And I think that's my last slide, so I'll stop at this point. And if you have questions, I'm very happy to answer them, or try to answer them. Are vocabulary designers more born or more made? Oh, Anthony. Well, I think I was born. And I know some people just aren't good at it. On the other hand, I could have had all the potential talent in the world, and without some training, self-training though it was, I wouldn't necessarily have been a good indexer. I think some of both. I think somebody can be trained to be good. There may be an element of something more than that, just a natural affinity to really love it and put in the time that it takes to be really good at it. Good question, Joletta. You're right. I mean, my career, luck and just chance and being willing to take risks had a lot to do with the way that it unfolded. I was a broad person. I mean, that was one reason I majored in philosophy, was because it was about everything. And it was the reason I liked school libraries, was because they were about everything. And I think you can do it either way, and either way can work. For me, what worked best was being broad and then convincing other people that I could do the specialized thing they wanted me to do, and just getting lucky sometimes when nobody else volunteered to do it or applied for the job. So I think it depends. I think it depends on your own passion more than anything. If you have a passion for a particular niche, go for it. You know, do everything you can in that direction. If you're interested in everything and have trouble finding a niche, don't leave yourself in the position where you really don't know how to do anything, but be as broad as you can, while still, you need to have some skills that you can sell, okay? Suggestions to an MLIS student who would like to enter the indexing profession after graduation. You're welcome, Joletta. Probably not to, in a way. The kind of indexing that you do if you're working for a journal index like I did has a very short career path. You can be the indexer, you can be the editor of the index, and if they ever decide they're going to issue a new index, you might get to be the vocabulary designer of the index. Anything higher than that, and you're going into something where it's more administration and doesn't have anything that you're passionate about, if you went into indexing because you were passionate about it. So it was a good job for me because it led me to other things, not because it had a built-in career path. I think where the career paths now are in web design. There are a lot of job ads for taxonomists. There are information architecture teams that hire people who know about taxonomies. So that's really where the neat jobs are now that actually have some potential for development. User experience is another example. Any kind of intranet design where you're trying to pull together all the knowledge within an organization, knowledge management is another place for it. I loved journal indexing, but as I say, it wasn't a career for me. It was something I could use to stay in that general area, but move on. And I think vocabulary design is a lot more. It's a higher level of work than indexing, and I think the opportunities in vocabulary design really are in website design more than anything else right now. Okay, vocabulary design and taxonomy. For a field that's based on what words mean, we are really bad with these words. Some people use classification to mean any kind of knowledge organization, whether it's subject headings, whether it's a classification system, whether it's called a taxonomy or whatever. Other people, including me, use vocabulary design to mean anything that relates to knowledge organization, whether it's subject headings or classification systems or whatever. Taxonomy tends to be hierarchical. It's more, the way that it gets used most often is to refer to some kind of hierarchical system like what we have on SwissWeb, where you can go from the front page to current students to graduation to subtopics below graduation. And when you talk about taxonomy on the web, that's often what you mean. There are also faceted taxonomies, which I can't really talk about tonight, but it's a different kind of still organizing things on the web. Some people, when they mean vocabulary design, mean only thesauri, only subject headings, only descriptors. And it's just messy. So I use vocabulary design in two ways. One, to mean the narrow sense of thesauri, and also in the broader sense to include any kind of subject organization system. And I try to be clear in class which I'm talking about. Because we don't really have an organized vocabulary for talking about our organized vocabularies. Okay, yeah, you've seen the term, Frank. But basically, it's all doing the same thing. It's using words to create some kind of subject organization for some kind of information. Synonyms and related terms. If you've got a good thesaurus, the thesaurus deals with it. It creates an entry vocabulary so that if I'm thinking of casualty insurance, it will tell me to use liability insurance instead. Or if the article talked about casualty insurance, I could look at the thesaurus if I didn't already know and find that for casualty insurance the authorized term was liability insurance. One of the really, and this is where indexing gets so interesting again, and I mean indexing, but vocabulary design is interesting in the same way, is how similar do two things have to be to use the same term for them? Barns and stables. You know, you can use those two words interchangeably in some contexts, and in other contexts you don't. And that's why you can spend so long trying to decide which word you ought to use or how you ought to define them, because it's not at all clear how similar two things have to be considered similar for your particular subject vocabulary. So the way that I dealt with it was either hoping that the thesaurus had C references or use references, which are the same thing, or by deciding in my own mind whether two things were similar enough to be given the same indexing term or not. I mean, you're really talking about what is the meaning, not quite of life, but what is the meaning of words when you're doing indexing. And those are the hard questions, and that's what makes it so interesting. I went to work there at the perfect time. You know, if I could have picked the time I went to work for UMI, I would have picked the time I did, because they had been a print index for a long time, and they were just making the transition to being an online database. And so the reason that was so fascinating was because we had to make some changes for the online environment. And the one that I can pull out of my mind really quickly is when we were a print index, it didn't really matter how an abstract was worded as long as it conveyed the meaning of the article, as long as it gave somebody who read it enough information to say, yes, I want to see this article, or no, I don't want to see this article. Once we went online, abstracts were a searchable field. And so all of a sudden, the words in the abstract really mattered, because people could search the abstracts to try to find the topics they wanted if there wasn't a descriptor for it, if there wasn't a subject heading for it. So what we began doing with the abstracts was being careful not to duplicate any of the words that were in the subject headings or the titles that were there if we could avoid it, because we were trying to give people additional access points. From the point of view of the searcher, there's no value in having universal life insurance mentioned in the abstract if you've also assigned universal life insurance as a descriptor. What's more important is for somebody who doesn't know the descriptor universal life insurance, for you to use a synonym for it in the abstract so that they've got an additional way into the collection if they need it. That was probably the biggest change that going online made. I mean, there were other differences over time just in physically how the indexing was done. When I started doing it, I wrote out by hand the indexing terms and the abstract and the other descriptive information about the article. By the time I left and then somebody else took what I had written and sat there for 8 hours a day and did data entry, just copying what the indexers did into an online database. And that just must have been a horrible job. But then with the development of technology, they got to where you could enter the terms right online, and cut out that whole middle step. So I was there at a really interesting time because we were both. It sounds like maybe we've come to the natural end of this whatever this is, this meeting. I hate to call it a presentation. I guess it was sort of. But whatever it is that we've been doing for the last hour and 4 minutes, it seems like maybe we're at the end of it. Are there any last questions? Okay, then I'll let go of the mic because, Frank, I think you're going to bring this to an end.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Weedman. That was a very interesting talk, and I'm sure we could have actually kept you here even longer. I know myself, I probably had a few more questions that I could throw out, but it does seem like a natural end to the evening. So thank you so much for coming and speaking to our chapter. I guess I'll just leave it at that. I think Sarah might have a couple closing comments for just sort of general chapter-related stuff, but that formally sort of ends this. I was referring to it as a professional talk, a professional speaker event. Thanks to everyone who joined and asked questions, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to Sarah now.
I'm going to grab the mic just for 1 second to say thank you for inviting me to do this, because it's been really fun, and it gave me a chance to think about some things I haven't thought about for a long time. And it's been good to have this interaction with all of you this evening, so thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Weedman, for your very interesting and enlightening presentation. And thank you to Frank as moderator for organizing this program. And thank you to everyone for attending our Faculty Primetime event tonight. I hope to see you all again in our next program this semester, a faculty panel on the 2011 ASIS annual meeting, which will be taking place on October 24th. And if you haven't already, please consider joining the ASIS student chapter, as we have a lot of exciting things planned for the upcoming year and would love to have you join us. Patricia DeCruz, our membership director, will be the last to leave the Illuminate session tonight if anyone wishes to stay after the meeting to chat about the student chapter. In addition, our next business meeting is on October 26th at 6 p.m. Good night, everyone.